get into an airplane, the first airplane in this case, and get that 750 pounds off the ground and even remotely begin to control it and fly it down the field. We've come a long way. It's kind of hard to imagine, 66 years between this airplane and walking on the moon.
I think I feel it's talking about the cable. Maybe
Right here,
we stick a turnbuckle in there.
Pull that up, make that tighter. We aren't just born knowing how to fly. The Wrights realized that you had to actually learn to control an airplane before you could ever even dream of getting in it.
Others had failed. Some had died in the attempt. But the Wrights had understood that if they were to succeed and survive, they would have to control their flyer in 3 dimensions. They invented a system which would flex its wings like a bird. They called it wing warping.
Right a little bit, a little more. The Wrights came here to Kitty Hawk for the wind conditions. It's about 500 miles from Dayton to this barrier island. From there, they had to offload at the village of Kitty Hawk, and things had to be put on wagons and then taken to the site where they were at. You have to remember, the airplane didn't come assembled. It came in pieces. Everything was in a barrel or a box. They had some propeller shafts that failed. Orville ends up having to get on a train and go back to Dayton and make new shafts and come back.
Switch on.
Switch off?
Switch off.
Switch on?
Switch on.
Everything the Wrights used, they had to make themselves, even the engine. None existed that was light enough and powerful enough to do the job they needed. So, in a foundry in Dayton, they built their own.
Put yourself in a situation where you've never seen an airplane, you've never read about an airplane, and here's this machine sitting there, and you're put into it and told to go fly it around. That's really quite frightening. I think that the bravery is never really addressed with these two. It's a large mass pivoting around you. It's complicated, it's difficult, and it's scary.
At 10:30 on December 17, 1903, Orville Wright entered a new world. Seconds and 90 yards of flight that changed the history of the 20th century. At first, the Wrights were simply not believed. However, little by little, they refined their machine. And 2 years later, the Wrights were 5 miles at a stretch. They were still the only people in the world who possessed a practical, powered aircraft. Until that time, Europe had been the leader in the race towards the sky. But efforts there, in France especially, had concentrated on airships, like that of the Brazilian Albert Santos Dumont, who caused a storm of excitement by flying his airship over Paris. But Europeans were still a long way from their first real airplane. It wasn't until 1906, a year after the Wrights had flown 25 miles, that Santos Dumont took Europe's first 60-yard hop in his extraordinary 14 bis. Among those watching was Louis Blériot, the Frenchman, who 3 years later was to catch the imagination of the world. On a blustery morning in July 1909, he pointed his plane towards the seaway which divides Britain from France, the English Channel, chasing a 1,000-pound prize. It was a dangerous gamble. But 36.5 minutes later, he landed his plane in England to the delight of his compatriots. In just over a half an hour, he had become aviation's first star. His flight had been a catalyst for a new explosion of interest in man's newest adventure. People went out to buy planes. They thronged to air meets. A new figure, the pilot hero, had been born. It wasn't long before the shape of aircraft began to conform to a standard. Engine at the front, wings in the middle, tail behind. Typical of the planes of the period is the British Avro triplane built by A.V. Rowe in 1909. It is a masterpiece of design, elegant and practical. In the triplane, the controls have been refined into a system whose principles are with us still, though it retains the Wright brothers' old technique of wing warping.
Roll set. And contact.
It was airplanes like this that introduced man to the sheer exhilaration of flight. Legendary Avro 504. It was tougher and more solid than the triplane, with only 2 wings and more effective controls. It was a winner. Nearly 9,000 of these planes were built between 1913 and 1931, when it finally went out of service. With the arrival of the 504, aviation became a science. New flyers drawn to the skies could learn from it the principles of flight. In the days of the early pioneers, the novice pilot had to train on a wing and a prayer. Now, he had a syllabus to follow. Streamlined training became even more important during the First World War. Pilots were now in huge demand. 26,000 were trained by the British Royal Flying Corps alone. So, at the war's end, there was an enormous surplus of trained pilots and cheap planes. One result was show business. At the same time, along came the new airmail service, which brought together into one vast correspondence huge tracts of land like the United States. And Now was the age of the trailblazers who set out to find long-distance routes across the world. Alan Cobham flew the length of Africa. We had flown up from the blistering heat of the Sudan to Uganda. I was called Bwana Mkubwa Ya Ndege, the great master of the bird. Then in 1927 came the most famous trailblazer of them all.
A bashful 25-year-old flyer climbed into a monoplane called the Spirit of St. Louis. From a New York airport, he took off into the darkness on the first solo flight across the Atlantic.
33 and a half hours later, Charles Lindbergh landed in France to become, overnight, the most famous man on Earth. He had succeeded in shrinking the gap between Europe and America.
Then he returned to America, and in New York received the most stupendous welcome of them all. Lucky Lindy, they called him that.
Planes were getting bigger. You no longer had to be a pilot to fly. Suddenly, you could be a passenger in a commercial aircraft. The United States, with its great distances, became the ideal place to pioneer commercial aviation.
Plane from New York and the east, arriving 4:20 on time.
The new passengers demanded comfort, and for this, the airlines demanded new aircraft. TWA called in the Donald Douglas Company, which came up after two early models with the DC-3. Chief Design Engineer Arthur Raymond.
You can almost tell when an airplane is going to be a good airplane or not by how it looks. This is a very beautiful airplane for the time. It was much more beautiful than the DC-2 because of the rounded fuselage, and everything was sort of a development of something before, so that it looked like a finished product. You couldn't think of making it any better.
The DC-3, or the Dakota, could fly farther, faster, with more passengers, in more comfort than any aircraft of the times. The first airplane, recognizably, of the modern age. By the end of the 30s, this tough, graceful little workhorse was flying more passengers than any other plane. And during the Second World War, it became the Allies' most important air transport, doted on by those who flew it. It became a legend for its endurance. In 1950, a DC-3 was abandoned on a glacier in Iceland. 8 months later, it was still there under 15 feet of snow when they came to salvage it.
The plane was stranded, it was left there. So it was just about a brand new aircraft. So we thought it was a shame to leave it there, so we were thinking about maybe get it down. Of course, we had to use the caterpillars to move the snow from it. And like I said right now, when we found the airplane, we opened the window and put the master switch on, and everything like that. Instrument panel and even the radios, they were working. The battery was good.
It was towed for 40 miles down the glacier and then took off perfectly and flew to Reykjavik without a hitch. And today, 50 years after it was first put into service, the DC-3 is working still, here carrying passengers between Boston and Cape Cod. Proud pilot George Felton is taking off in a DC-3 that has flown more hours than any other plane on Earth.
36 is the highest time aircraft in the world. It's the all-time record setter. It's got 90,191 hours on it, which is well over 10 years. Enough to go around the world 550 some odd times maybe. The landing gear is very strong on it. The engines are very strong. There's 3 spires that hold it in the wing. The wings are held on by 328 nuts and bolts. When you see one apart, it's built like a bridge in there with all the trusses and corrugated metal and everything. It's just built very, very strong. I got up in a DC-3, I just feel peaceful as serenity for me. It's just nostalgic and they're comfortable. And they get you there, and they're very, very safe. I feel very proud. I big airplanes, wishing they were in my position. You know, I don't wish I was in theirs. I really don't.
But just as the DC-3 was taking the piston-engine airplane into its golden age, one man had already conceived the idea that would overtake it. Less than a generation after the Wright brothers, a young English air cadet named Frank Whittle was developing a new engine, the jet.
I decided that in order to fly very fast and very far, one would have to go very high. I realized that the piston engine couldn't possibly work in the thin air of great heights, and the propeller wouldn't be suitable for speeds of the order of 500 miles an hour.
I use this to pull in air at the front and to compress it into combustion chambers, like this, where the injection and burning of fuel heats and expands the air and gives it enough energy to drive a turbine.
As a result of trying various schemes for 18 months, I ended up at the end of 1929 with the idea for the turbojet. In those days, not only was I up against engineering design problems, but there was a tremendous intellectual opposition in that a lot of the people I was having to deal with, I think, felt an inevitable reluctance to see all their knowledge thrown into the wastebasket.
The first perilous run of the turbojet took place in 1937. But Whittle's problems were not over. Making an operational engine took 2 more years. Building an aircraft to carry it, another 2. It was only with the beginning of the Second World War that official indifference ended, and his first jet aircraft, the E-2839, was readied for trial.
The flight trials proper took place in May of 1941 and were completely successful. The E-28 did about 17 test flights in 12 days and then continued to fly on and off throughout the war with that engine and others.
I was the lucky bloke who had to demonstrate the Gloucester-Whittle E-2839 to Winston Churchill at Hatfield Aerodrome. We had only done level flight up to date, and we were certainly not going to do any aerobatics because it was rather an important aeroplane. So we decided that what we could demonstrate was speed. So we kept it at about tree height with about 400 on the clock. Winston was suitably impressed because from then onwards a little push was given for both the Vampire and the Meteor.
Britain's first operational jet was the twin-engine Gloucester Meteor, which came into service in 1944, too late for action against enemy fighters. By that time, the Americans were in the jet game too, for the British had passed on the results of Whittle's work to the United States.
We virtually gave the Americans the whole job, and the American government selected the General Electric to build the engine, which they did very speedily. They had their first engine running in 6 months, and just a few months later they had several other engines, more than we had.
Incredible as it may seem, these crates marked the start of the development of the first jet engine in America.
I'll give you the Whittle engine.
The Americans gave an undertaking that they would only use the information for war purposes. Well, it's an extraordinary thing, but the socialist government of 1945 and 1946 and after let the Americans off the hook for a total payment of $3,800,000. It wasn't too long before they stole the lead in aviation.
TNT, story of our conquest of the air.
Fall encompasses science, beauty, adventure, and freedom.
Part 2 chronicles the past and... Sam Waterston, Waterkiller. And now back to Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original.
The Mojave Desert in California, the hot, flat surface of Muroc Dry Lake. This is Edwards Air Force Base, the home of American experimental aviation and of airplanes at the cutting edge of technical research, planes like the X-29. After the war, with Europe devastated, this is where the new frontiers of flying would be pushed back by some well-funded and brilliantly organized research called the X program. Within 10 years, this program would force new aircraft through the sound barrier and on to speeds of 2,000 miles an hour. 10 years after that, it would bring them to the edge of space. The sound barrier, Mach 1, was the first challenge. Others had tried to pass through it and lost their lives in the attempt. So an experimental aircraft, the X-1, was built to confront it. Its pilot was World War II ace Chuck Yeager.
The X-1 was mine because the old man said, okay, it's your program, get with it. And the only reason he picked me is because I was trained in maintenance and I understood systems and obviously could fly an airplane. We didn't look at ourselves as heroes, pioneers, or anything else. It's if we didn't do it, somebody else would. No airplane had ever flown much above 90% of the speed of sound until we got the X-1 up there. Every flight that we made, we were in a region where no one had ever had an airplane before. In fact, we didn't even have any wind tunnel data in that region. So it was every day something new.
On October 14, 1947, a B-29 with Yeager aboard and his X-1 slung beneath it took off. Yeager probably shouldn't have been flying.
I was hurting because I'd been in a horseback riding accident. I broke a couple of ribs, hurt my shoulder a couple of nights before, and I wasn't feeling too good, but the point was I made the decision to fly the airplane. Came back into Bombay, got on the ladder, and they slid the ladder down to your opposite nose on the X-1, and you're sitting here about 12,000 feet above the ground, the wind blowing, you slide in feet first. That's the way you got into the X-1. The flight itself just went as expected. We've been having a lot of trouble with fires in the tail of the airplane and igniters that wouldn't work. Fortunately, they all worked that day, and we pushed the thing out. And really, once we got the Mach jump on the Mach meter and all the buffeting smoothed out, we got our first sonic boom here. Then it almost was a letdown. You know, the damn thing didn't blow up. The combat experience I had made me a very disciplined pilot, meaning that I learned to control my emotions and feelings toward the outcome. It didn't make any difference to me whether the X-1 blew into a million pieces or not. See, because I couldn't do anything about it. So I put it out of your mind. And you do that in combat. We realized that the so-called sound barrier really restricted us from going any faster. And once we got the X-1 above the speed of sound, then smoked on out to Mach 2 and then beyond, we realized, hey, this opens up the whole universe for us.
This was pioneering on a new and lavish scale. Each aircraft at Edwards was built to test some particular aspect of research: engines, aerodynamics, even spacesuits. They were not so much prototype aircraft as flying laboratories. The X-15 was the most spectacular of them all. The aircraft that was to win some of its pilots astronauts' wings, as it carried them to the edge of the Earth's atmosphere at nearly 7 times the speed of sound, over 4,500 miles an hour. The testing area was way up, often over 50 miles above the Earth. So the X-15 had to be suspended under a B-52 bomber and air-launched. Most flights were short. All were dangerous. One of the test pilots was Scott Crossfield.
I never considered the X-15 dangerous. I knew that it was a very tight and tough program. It wasn't the goggles and scarf and the breeze going out and laying your life on the line, nothing like that. I'm an engineer, and we do things with deliberate design and thought. Of course, there's one man in the X-15, and there were 5 in the B-52, and if we had trouble, they would throw away the X-15, because, of course, it's a very volatile bomb. clear that I didn't do anything wrong and spoil all those other people's work.
Going off now. Deal, buddy. Beginning to turn in. I'll land a little long on the lake of a hunch. You got it? About 30 feet. I just hold it steady and you'll put it right there.
People would try to tell you what was going to happen or what it was going to be like, but it was a tremendous shock when you launched. You just, pow, you were dropped off, and of course the airplane would tend to roll off, and the first thing you had to do was get the engine lit. And then all of a sudden here I was sitting there with my head back and I couldn't move it because of the thrust of the engine. I finally got up to the conditions where I was supposed to shut the engine off, and I told Bill Dana that this was one aircraft that I was happy to shut the engine off on.
My first flight, the X-15, I went to Mach 4, my first flight, and I'd never been above Mach 2 before that, and everything happened just a little bit faster than I really wanted it to. It wasn't until I got down to about Mach 2 again in the traffic pattern that I felt like I'd caught up with the airplane. It was a wild ride, and the people that got to Mach 6 in it went from Mach 5 to Mach 6 in 8 seconds, which is moving right on down the road. Later, as I got to go to higher altitudes where I got more into the spectacular, you'd look down and see the bright blue ring of atmosphere, maybe see 200 or 300 miles, and that was kind of exciting.
As you got to the higher speeds, you knew the airplane was getting very hot because all of a sudden it would pop or bang and you could feel the airplane twitch. And it turned out that this was due to panels on the aircraft actually buckling, but along with that, occasionally you'd see wisps of smoke coming up in the cockpit, and you really weren't sure what was happening. I guess test pilots aren't supposed to say they're afraid, but I was impressed.
Scott, Jeff, and Central anytime. Central coming off now. Central off. It's off. Central is off.
You haven't got time to indulge in emotions or personal thoughts. Your total concentration is on the job at hand. And you go over in your mind everything you're going to do, because there's no time to go to a book and look up things. I thought the rear landing gear had broken. The attitude was not that much different. I was afraid a fire was still on, so I stayed in the cockpit until the rescue people got there, because I'm in a very good steel protective environment with a pressure suit on, so I could have gone through quite a fire.
Ground tests at Edwards could be equally hazardous, especially when it came to testing new engines.
I've always joked that the way they build pilots' confidence, that he gets in the cockpit and everybody else gets in the blockhouse. This is what we did this day. It's like a graveyard out there. You don't see anybody anywhere. And we ran the engine, and one of the things I had to do was shut it down after throttling it through several thrust levels, and then restart it. And I restarted, and it had an automatic shutdown. So I pushed the reset button, and at that instant, the whole thing went to sky high. It was a pretty impressive fire. It blew the cockpit about 20 feet forward up to the edge of the fire, though it was quite like being in the sun. It was very bright orange. And so I just shut everything down, and I was just going to sit there and wait the fire out. About 15 minutes later, the newsman started calling. I don't know what kind of a pipeline they have, but to calm them down, I told them the only casualty was a press in my pants because the fireman had gotten me wet. And so, of course, an East Coast newspaper the next day had a headline, X-15 blows up, pilot wets pants.
Then, in 1957, without warning, the Russians broke into space with the first Sputnik, and work on new aircraft was suddenly canceled. The future of the space program was to belong not to pilots, but to astronauts and rockets.
Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original, will reach to Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We made one of the gravest errors of my generation, and we parked the whole aeronautical industry and stopped the research airplane program. And space by forfeit then went to the medicine men, the missileers, and the Germans, all with their terrible disdain for pilots and wings and aeronautics about which they knew nothing. These people didn't understand the reliability that went with man-rated systems, because everything they ever made, if it worked, they never saw it again, and if it didn't work, they never saw the pieces hardly again. And they, to this day, they still clap and cheer when something works. I've never seen that when an airplane flew.
Coming back in a capsule was a very undignified way to come back from space, especially for a pilot. And so we felt that if we could develop an aircraft-type vehicle, the pilot could fly that back from space. Much better way to come back, in our opinion. So we decided to build a small demonstrator without asking for headquarters approval, because we were a little afraid that because of the politics they would say no.
The flyers at Edwards tried out a shape that would fly without wings, called a lifting body. They pulled it behind a car.
It was pretty bizarre flying a very advanced spacecraft behind a Pontiac out in the middle of the desert, thinking that this might lead to a new spacecraft.
The official research program later took up the flyer's idea. What it wanted was a reusable spacecraft, one that could fly back to Earth when its space journey was done. Those who tested it ran great risks. The edge of the unknown is a dangerous place.
Always the winged airplanes, the lifting airplanes that I could relate to. So even though I admired the people that flew the Mercury and the Gemini and the Apollo, it was something that I didn't want to be a part of. And I was glad when the shuttle came along and put wings back on the spacecraft.
April 12, 1981. Within a lifetime, the proving ground of Kitty Hawk has become the proving ground of space. Pilots John Young and Bob Crippen put their lives on the line to show that man can go into space and fly back to Earth.
Chris Cripp, wait and go fly. He doesn't look very nervous, but you can see I have a nervous smile. I think I was as nervous as Cripp was, but I'm just so old that my heart wouldn't go any faster. Anybody who's not apprehensive about climbing on top of a first-time flight of a liquid hydrogen oxygen rocket ship really doesn't understand the problem. And I think both Cripp and I were fairly nervous.
Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4. We've gone for main engine start.
Only 78 years after the Wright brothers launched their first fragile airplane, Young and Crippen are bringing an airplane back from space.
This is re-entry. We're probably moving at Mach 18.6, and you could feel the vehicle turning right up over the water. Really tremendous. There was the Mach 10 roll reversal. This is a roll back at Mach 4.8 over Bakersfield, California. The vehicle was behaving very solidly. It's a beautiful handling machine. Looking very smooth, speed brake. We're coming down at 20 degrees gamma, which is about 6 times steeper than the average airliner makes an approach. You maintain your airspeed out there at about 285 knots, equivalent airspeed.
50 feet. 40, 30, 20, 10, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, touchdown.
I have to say it's one of my best landings because I made a whole bunch of landings in T-38s right after the flight, and none were as good as that one.
The flight was a success, but they needed the resources and the manpower of the richest economy in the world. Testing the unknown, reaching beyond the skies, has become the most expensive business on Earth. There are still new challenges, of course. Steps to take as daring as those first taken by the Wright brothers. A spacecraft that can take off from a runway, for example. NASA is already designing one called the National Aerospace Plane. Britain has another, HOTL. In the end, only the energies and wealth of countries and corporations will get them off the ground. But there is still a place for individuals, for the lone inventors who, in their garages and dreams, first launched the romance of modern aviation. This is a revolutionary new plane, built of new materials, conceived by a solo visionary, a starship. The man touched by the same vision as the Wright brothers, Burt Rutan.
I had a model airplane background. And I found that, yes, indeed, it is possible to build your airplane in your garage and go out and fly it. And I somewhat stumbled on this method of molded composite construction, not really knowing whether they would be acceptable ways to produce airplanes. I was able to produce an airplane in 3 months. That was the big breakthrough. From then on, I realized, my gosh, if I can build an airplane in 3-4 months, no reason why I can't, over a couple of years, develop and test 4, 5, or 6 configurations. The most significant thing was not just the stall-limiting canard aerodynamics. I think the reason that I've been called a pioneer is that in 20 years I've developed, flight tested, flown over 20 different types of airplanes, using the composites primarily as a shortcut so that I can build a wing this week instead of taking months to 2 weeks to build.
Rutan created Voyager, that most remarkable of aircraft, designed to circle the world without landing or refueling. Like the early pioneers, he brought the edges of the unknown and the impossible a little closer.
I didn't invent a new technology or a new material for Voyager. I stuck my neck out and applied it without asking myself, gee, isn't that too dangerous, or won't that maybe not work? Well, of course, it's dangerous as hell to make an airplane that if we'd have had a little bit of turbulence after takeoff, we'd have lost the airplane crew. And if I'd have added 2 or 3% more weight to it, it'd have gone off the end of the runway in flames. I think the world of aviation will gain from me mostly inspiration. The fact that a few people, literally in a garage or a small shop, built an airplane that doubled an absolute distance record, flew all the way around the world, flew through all this weather and came back home safely. The fact that that was done all composite, without mixing metals, without solving all these stupid problems that the engineers made for themselves, that will provide the inspiration that, my God, it can be done. We're going to do it. We'll stick our necks out. I knew how the Wright brothers felt when they came upon these things and had success.
NT Original continues with a look at aviation firsts, Trailblazers.
May the 20th, 1927. A young American flyer sets out on a journey that will shrink the world.
Contact.
In his aircraft, Spirit of St. Louis, Charles Lindbergh will be the first man to fly the Atlantic solo and become one of aviation's greatest trailblazers.
Well out, smooth rotation continuing. They've come up to 20 degrees, she's airborne. She flies.
April 1969. Another trailblazing flight. This time it's the world's first supersonic airliner, the Anglo-French Concorde. Lindbergh had taken 33 and a half hours to cross the Atlantic. Concorde would soon be offering a regular service that took less than 3. The ultimate earth shrinker.
Aviation has shrunk the world to livable size, and it's made one community of the world. It's changed our whole manner of thinking and living on this little globe. I think in my wildest dreams I never anticipated how far and how fast we would go.
Exactly 50 years separated Concorde's maiden flight and the very first direct crossing of the Atlantic in a converted Vickers Bimini bomber. 1919 was the year that aviation trailblazing took off. With the First World War over, there were tens of thousands of planes looking for something to do. For the first time, countries could be linked and oceans crossed. The skies of the world cried out to be conquered. Indeed, the challenge had been thrown down 6 years earlier by the Daily Mail of London. A 10,000-pound prize for the first non-stop crossing of the Atlantic. In June 1919, 2 Royal Air Force pilots, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, arrived in Newfoundland to attempt the 2,000-mile flight to Ireland. Their Vickers Bimini had arrived in crates from England and was assembled on site. Meanwhile, another attempt was underway. 3 Curtiss flying boats of the U.S. Navy set out from Newfoundland to cross the Atlantic in stages. First stop was the Azores to refuel. 2 aircraft failed to get there, though their crews were saved. The third, flown by Lieutenant Commander Reed with a crew of 5, made it and went on via Lisbon to reach Plymouth. Their journey, the first flight of any kind across the Atlantic, had taken 15 days. Back in North America, no less than 12 different aircraft were trying for the 10,000-pound prize. By June 14th, the Bimini of Alcock and Brown was ready for takeoff from the grass strip of St. John's. Groaning with 870 gallons of fuel needed for the flight, The Bimini slowly took off and headed east at a height of 1,200 feet. Overnight, the two pilots battled with fog banks, storms, ice, and dense cloud, while the world waited for news. After 16 hours, they finally reached the coast of Ireland and landed in a bog. An unceremonious end to a great adventure, but both men became instant heroes, claimed their prize, and were knighted. The first non-stop crossing of the Atlantic in 1919 was just one of the many trailblazing achievements of that remarkable year. In November, two Australian brothers, Ross and Keith Smith, returning from Europe after the war, took up another challenge. The Australian government had offered £10,000 for the first flight from London to Australia in under 30 days. After an eventful journey of 11,500 miles, the Smiths landed in Darwin with 2 days to spare. Behind such flights was the prospect of commercial aviation. It would be many years before such long distances could be flown by fare-paying passengers. But over shorter distances, commercial flights were already underway. The first international service began between Paris and Brussels in converted French bombers. But it was not a daily service. That began on April 25, 1919, between London and Paris. It cost £21 and took 2.5 hours. Within a few years, airlines were opening up all over Europe. Other ways were being devised for ex-wartime pilots to show off their skills.
Had the idea of using surplus planes for circuses, flying circuses. Some went around barnstorming to give people 5-minute flights. It was all very novel, but disorganized.
One of the most popular barnstorming aircraft in the United States was the Curtiss Jenny.
The Jenny was a good airplane. You could maneuver that Jenny just anyway and get away with it. I mean, you spin it, stall it, side flip it into a field or anything you wanted to do. It was nice to loop, and it was a great airplane for its day. It was easy to handle, no hard work.
In Britain, throughout the 1920s, the showmanship of Alan Cobham's Flying Circus thrilled the crowds. Behind the stunts was a serious purpose, to sell the potential of flying to young and old alike. There were, of course, still plenty of trailblazing routes to conquer, including the ultimate challenge, a flight around the Earth. 26,000 miles over oceans, deserts, mountains, and jungles. In 1924, a group of United States Army Corps flyers assembled in Seattle, on America's west coast, to attempt the epic journey. 4 aircraft, Douglas World Cruisers, adaptable to wheels or floats, set off in April. They headed north to Alaska, where the lead aircraft crashed on a mountain, though the 2 crew were unhurt. The others flew on, along the Aleutian Island chain to Japan, moving in short hops across Asia, through Europe, and to Britain. Wherever they stopped along the way, presidents, politicians, and public all flocked to see the intrepid aviators and their flying machines. In the north of Scotland, they changed back to floats for the final challenge, the Atlantic crossing by way of Iceland and then on to Newfoundland and Labrador. On the first Atlantic leg, another cruiser crashed, but its crew was rescued. The 2 surviving crews clambered ashore onto American soil to a warm welcome. But this was small compared to the greetings they were to receive on their journey across the United States, culminating in a tremendous reception at Seattle, where their adventure began. completed the first circumnavigation of the world by air. It had taken 175 days. Behind these trailblazing achievements came the commercial spin-offs. The United States Post Office soon saw the potential of an airmail, and services between cities sprang up all over the country. To start with, it was the pilots of the Army Air Corps who flew the mail. But soon private companies began to compete for post office contracts. A new hero now entered the public imagination, the mail pilot, whose exploits fired the enthusiasm of a younger generation of flyers.
Well, as a boy 11 years old, working at Sid Chaplin Aerodrome, South Hollywood, going out to the field after school on our bicycles, my brother and I, we got acquainted with some of the pilots. And so from then, we kept working around the airport. My idea was to fly the mail because I could fly, and I'd hear these stories about these intrepid mail pilots in the Midwest from Omaha to San Francisco and going across to Washington. This is before passenger lines were flying, and before Lindbergh flew to Paris. I couldn't wait to get back and start flying the mail. Looking out from 1,500 feet high and doing 80 miles an hour, fastest we'd ever been, and hearing the wind whistling and so forth, and smelling even some of the gas fumes coming back and watching those rocker arms on the front of the engine. From then on, that was it. We had finally reached a point where we knew we were going to stay in these airplanes. That was all there was to it. And it was it's been so many years ago. It's been 60-something years ago.
Before the coming of the airmail, it took almost a week for a letter to cross the country. Once regular transcontinental mail flights were inaugurated, it took just 2 days.
The early mail pilots were he-men. They were rough and ready, but lovable fellows who were in the thing because it was a new and dangerous business. Before the navigation aids had been installed, they had to learn their route like a book. Every hill, tree, and river, village, to guide themselves in all kinds of weather.
It'd be a beautiful day, no passengers, no nothing else but just you and the mail and God. You'd get down, you'd fly low, and I said, gee, what day is this? I'm enjoying flying, and oh yeah, there's Miss Fuller's farmhouse. I used to see it from 6,000 feet. I'm right down over the top of the barn. They'd be out waving, and the laundry would be out hanging on the line. I'd say, hey, gee, yeah, that must be Monday. Monday's worst day.
I used to drop a newspaper off to my sister. She lived on the farm right on the route between Iowa City and Chicago. And I used to drop her a newspaper every time I fly over. Today, you'd be 5 or 6 miles up in the air, and if you dropped the newspaper, you'd probably land in England. You couldn't do that today.
As time went on, we acquired more knowledge. There's primitive flying. We push our luck sometimes in order to make a good point for the company that had to contract mail carriers. So there were many flights. I look back at them now that I feel a little bit fortunate that I'm here.
It was subsidies from the post office that launched and sustained the airmail. In time, these subsidies led to corruption and scandal. But without them, the U.S. airmail would never have kept flying.
for the Skies, Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original.
In Britain, it was the vast size of its empire that attracted the Trailblazer. In 1925, Alan Cobham set off from Croydon near London on a long-distance flight to survey potential routes for the recently formed Imperial Airways. His destination, Cape Town, an 8,000-mile journey down the length of Africa. His companions, a film cameraman and a mechanic.
One had no meteorological reports. They couldn't even telephone up ahead to find out what it was like. So you flying into the unknown as far as weather was concerned. You might be below cloud, you might meet a snowstorm, you might meet a dust storm, but you never knew what was ahead of you. One is amazed how on earth he ever found these strips which the local men had cleared in the jungle, but find them he did with a compass. No radar or any of those fancy things, a straightforward compass, and you just steered by looking over the top of the compass and said it must be about there. And somehow or other you found it and landed on this strip. And there this local commissioner would meet you, and there would be men posted about the airplane. I mean, animals really was what you were protecting the airplane from, in case they did any damage to it while it stayed there overnight. The organization that must have gone into these trips is interesting. The trip round Africa would have involved fantastic transportation problems. Cans of petrol have to be there waiting. You have to have made arrangements for that fuel to have been ferried up there, possibly by canoe and so on. The local natives come out to actually beat the land down with their feet and make the runway firm enough for father to be able to take off, because you can see before they do this there's one wheel sunk in the mud and clearly he would not be able to get off at all. Thousands of people turn out and welcome this pioneer from England. I should think some of them thought, this madman from England, and if you look at the country that had been traversed, you're inclined to agree with some of them as well.
London to Cape Town in 3 months. One of Cobham's many trailblazing flights across the British Empire.
By that method, he really opened the Empire Airlines step by step, long before there were airlines capable of doing it. These flights had tremendous publicity. The newspapers of England and often many other places in the world publicized the story, building him up as a great man, and people were enormously interested. He was the pop idol of the day.
Cobham might have convinced the public with his epic flights, but he still had to persuade the British government. To win them over, when he flew back from Australia, he took his case straight to Parliament by landing on the Thames at Westminster.
Lord Birkenhead replied, after I'd given my impassioned speech on having an air route to India immediately, and he said, at the present moment when I send a dispatch to India, I say, thank God I can't get a reply under 2 months. Now Cobham is going to have a reply in a week. Life will be unbearable. We don't want airlines.
For the determined aviator, the world still abounded in challenges. The aim of American explorer Commander Richard Byrd was to fly over the South Pole. From the start, appalling conditions delayed the attempt. The crew had to spend the winter in the Antarctic. Byrd's aircraft was a Ford trimotor, and to protect it from the intense cold, the team had to improvise an unusual hangar. Three years earlier, Byrd had successfully overflown the North Pole. Now he and his companions spent the dark winter months of 1929 holed up in their base camp, preparing for their attempt on the South Pole. Spring arrived at last, and with it, suitable weather. The first task was to dig out the trimotor and see if it had survived its hibernation. On November 28th, the trimotor, named the Floyd Bennett after Byrd's companion on his North Pole flight, took off with its crew of 4. Ahead lay a round trip of 1,600 miles, and little chance of rescue if they had to come down on the way. Fuel started to look dangerously low, so the crew threw out everything they could spare to light the airplane. At last, almost 10 hours into the flight, Commander Byrd reached 90 degrees south, the first man to fly over both poles. In the Himalayas, aviators found another challenge, Everest, the world's highest peak. In 1933, a British team led by the Marquess of Clydesdale arrived on the northern plains of India, determined to be the first to fly over the 29,000-foot summit. They had to wait for months for the right weather conditions. Storm clouds and strong winds over the mountains delayed the attempt.
Very few people had been over 30,000 feet, but there was worldwide interest in achieving a height record, and to that end the French had had a stab at it, the Italians had held the record, and recently the Americans. So high flying was a fairly unknown subject. Very special suits of 4-ply material were constructed and fitted with a very elaborate system of heating elements throughout, including boots and flying helmets. That in turn required large electric power, and therefore big generators had to be fitted to the machine. The helmets were similarly heated, and even the goggles and a face mask had their electrical elements.
The teams were also experimenting with cameras and film at low temperatures and great altitude.
The observer on it was taking pictures, and each time he changed a plate, he had to go back into the cockpit. And on one of these occasions, he trod on his flexible metal oxygen pipe. And then when he stood up, the pipe parted completely.
Without oxygen at that height, Bonnet would not have survived. But quick thinking on his part saved him, and the planes went on to fly over the summit.
He'd been working with his camera for a little bit longer, and then he began to pass out, and did eventually collapse completely into the bottom of the cockpit. The pilot couldn't do anything about this because there was the 2 separate cockpits.
The flight was a success, but as the cameraman had passed out, both aircraft flew the mission again 3 days later so their achievement could be properly filmed. Adventures like these captured the headlines. More significant for commercial aviation was the challenge to fly non-stop between the cities of New York and Paris, a competition that reached its peak some years earlier, at a tragic cost.
Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original, will return in a moment. And now back to Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original.
In 1926, French aviator René Fonck and his crew were ready to try for the $25,000 Ortig Prize, offered for the first successful crossing. The problem all these Atlantic challengers faced was the weight of the fuel that they had to carry. The critical moment was takeoff, when the load was heaviest. In the flames that engulfed Fonck's Sikorsky aircraft, 2 of his 5-man crew died. Undeterred, a queue of contenders joined the race to cross the Atlantic. Clarence Chamberlain and Lloyd Berthold began in style, but saw their hopes fall flat when their landing gear broke on a test flight. Commander Byrd was also among the hopefuls. An unfortunate landing postponed his challenge. American pilots Davis and Wooster were preparing for their attempt. On the final test, their tanks heavy with fuel, the aircraft became difficult to control. Soon after takeoff, it plunged into the ground. Both men were killed. From Europe came an attempt in the reverse direction, against the prevailing winds. French ace Charles Nougesor and his co-pilot Francois Corly set off from Le Bourget near Paris, heading west over the Atlantic. The aircraft named the White Bird and its two pilots were never seen again. Enter the next challenger, a converted Ryan aircraft named Spirit of St. Louis. 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh had persuaded some St. Louis businessmen to sponsor his bid. On May 20th, 1927, he was ready for the challenge that had cost so many lives.
Lindbergh was a dreamer. Certainly as an airman pilot, he had as much experience at flying without great assistance from aides on the ground. And so he couldn't resist the opportunity to participate in the race. He was not an extrovert. He was a very conservative character, but not too conservative to try to get the Atlantic.
Lindbergh would have to fly the journey blind, relying on a periscope or leaning out of the window to see what lay ahead. An extra-large fuel tank had been fitted directly in front of the cockpit between the wings for the best center of gravity. It completely cut off the view forward.
Brakes and contact!
Today, Lindbergh's spirit is not forgotten. Piloted by enthusiasts, this replica flies regularly, and Lindbergh's own experience of the epic adventure lives on in his writings.
What a beautiful machine it is, in front of the hangar, trim and slender, gleaming in its silver coat. All our ideas, all our calculations, all our hopes lie there before me, waiting to undergo the acid test of flight. For me, it seems to contain the whole future of aviation. When such planes can be built, there's no limitation to the air. My cockpit quivers with the engine's tenseness. Sharp explosions from the exhaust stacks speak with confidence and precision. But the Spirit of St. Louis isn't vibrant with power as it's always been before. I'm conscious of the great weight pressing tires into the ground, of the fragility of wings, of the fullness of oversized tanks of fuel. There is in my plane this morning more of earth and less of air than I've ever felt before. Over the first short stretch of sea on the route to France. The surface is calm. There's hardly a sign of movement beneath the oil-smooth sheen of its skin. It's only 35 miles to the Connecticut shore, but I've never flown across that much water before. I relax in my cockpit, this little box with fabric walls in which I'm to ride across the ocean. Now, if all goes well, I won't move from it for a day and a half, until I step out on French sod at the airport of Le Bourget. There's room enough, no more, no less. My cockpit's been tailored to me like a suit of clothes. Instrument readings are all normal. The engine sounds smoother than at the beginning of the flight. Possibly it's simply the smoothness or well-cared-for engine gains during the early hours of its life. Whatever the cause, there's something in its rhythm that assures me, and gives me confidence with which to enter the unknown space ahead, to climb up over the fog, over the sea, and into the night. It seems impossible to go on longer. All I want in life is to throw myself down flat, stretch out, and sleep. I've got to find some way to keep alert. There's no alternative but death and failure. No alternative but death and failure, I keep repeating, using the thought as a whip on my lagging mind, trying to make my senses realize the importance of what I'm saying.
After 33 and a half hours, the Spirit of St. Louis reached Paris.
It's only 100 yards to the hangars now. It would be better to come in straight, but if I don't side-slip, I'll be too high over the boundary to touch my wheels in the area of light. Not a bad landing. I start to taxi back toward the floodlights and hangars, but the entire field ahead is covered with running figures.
It seemed as if all Paris had turned out to greet him. With one flight, he had become a legend, joining the select group of aviation's pioneers, like Louis Blériot. On his return to America, his reception was no less triumphant. Everywhere he went, he drew an ecstatic welcome.
Lindbergh became the symbol of flight. And he was young, he was handsome, he was taciturn, and he was a kind of an ideal hero. Lindbergh captured the imagination of the world. He was dedicated to the gospel of flight. And it was all really to publicize flight. After all, if you become a god, you want your parishioners to keep on with the incense, if nothing else.
Lindbergh's flight fired an explosion of interest in commercial aviation.
Prime. Center engine primed. Ready to start, center engine. Clear center engine.
The Ford Trimotor, America's first purpose-built airliner, was ready to exploit the public interest.
It was built as a very sturdy plane, and it's still flying, some of them. It shows how very overstrong it had been built, because they didn't know what to expect. The Ford Motor Company had been interested in aviation by Bill Stout, who had built a single-engine plane. Mr. Ford felt he wanted more safety, and so we developed the Ford Trimotor plane.
So strongly built was the Trimotor, it could even loop the loop. Henry Ford set up a small production line in part of his giant Detroit car factory to build Trimotors.
We had 2 or 3 aeronautical engineers that came to the Ford Motor Company and supervised the construction of it. It was much more of a hand-built affair. There weren't so very many of them built, you know, altogether. I think it was one of the very first all-metal planes. With an enclosed cabin for the pilots, a wheel at the rear in place of a tail skid, and brakes so that it could operate more like an automobile in that sense. The corrugations were built so they ran in the direction of the wind. And this, we had quite an argument in Europe over this question, because the Europeans claimed they had a patent on the corrugations that ran in the same direction as the wind, which seemed too silly for words. Nothing like a modern plane. It's heavy. Sometimes you needed help from the co-pilot to handle it in rough weather. It had an excellent wing profile that gave it a good lift.
Coming up, Into the Skies, a TNT original.
In 1928, to fly to the West Coast, passengers from New York first had to take the train to Columbus, Ohio. There, they boarded the trimotor of TAT Airlines, which took them by stages to Los Angeles, including an overnight stop. One of the airline's executives was Eugene Vidal. His son, Gore Vidal, the writer, was the first child to fly across America.
When you look back on it, I mean, they were sublimely uncomfortable, not as uncomfortable as air travel now, naturally. First of all, you always had a container beside your seat, which you were to vomit. And the passengers would just go like that and then go on talking. The planes are going like that. And then, and I've never seen a description of this overwhelming smell of burning petrol. I mean, you really were almost asphyxiated at times because they hadn't worked out how to air condition these things. My father decided to serve lunch. It was the first time a meal had ever been served on an airplane. And my mother, who was very grand and always on a diet, said, oh, everybody loves consomme. Well, the first group from Washington, New York, who had the consomme were scalded to death. In those days, we were not so litigious, so there were no lawsuits. And after that, my father decreed hard-boiled eggs, the only thing they would serve. And coffee, but at your peril, it was always tepid.
For all the discomfort these early passengers experienced, they had the first memorable opportunity to see from the air the grandeur of the American continent. The journey ended at Burbank Airport in Los Angeles.
We went down so fast that both of my eardrums were cracked. And so, screaming up a storm, I'm taken off the plane with blood trickling down my tiny lobes. My father, the manager of the airline, he said, you loved that flight, didn't you, my boy? First child to have flown across the country is shrieking up a storm. And I'm just going like this at him, and the blood streaming down the ears. That is my memory of the first year of transcontinental flight.
Some early entrepreneurs realized that the new airliners offered other business opportunities.
I formed a company called Scenic Airways and bought two of the Ford motors and flew them out to the Grand Canyon for sightseeing service, which is still the oldest sightseeing service in operation. The first time I flew over the canyon, it's almost indescribable, but it's almost a religious feeling you get.
I think the world of aviation will gain from me mostly inspiration. The fact that a few people, literally in a garage or a small shop, built an airplane that doubled an absolute distance record, flew all the way around the world, flew through all this weather and came back home safely. The fact that that was done all composite, without mixing metals, without solving all these stupid problems that the engineers made for themselves, that will provide the inspiration that, my God, it can be done. We're going to do it. We'll stick our necks out. I knew how the Wright brothers felt when they came upon these things and had success.
Weekend Tea Original. This continues with a look at aviation firsts, trailblazers.
May the 20th, 1927. A young American flyer sets out on a journey that will shrink the world.
Where? Contact. Contact.
In his aircraft, Spirit of St. Louis, Charles Lindbergh will be the first man to fly the Atlantic solo and become one of aviation's greatest trailblazers.
Nose wheel well up, smooth rotation continuing. Nose come up to 20 degrees, she's airborne. She flies.
April 1969. Another trailblazing flight. This time it's the world's first supersonic airliner, the Anglo-French Concorde. Lindbergh had taken 33 and a half hours to cross the Atlantic. Concorde would soon be offering a regular service that took less than 3. The ultimate earth shrinker.
Aviation has shrunk the world to livable size, and it's made one community of the world. It's changed our whole manner of thinking and living on this little globe. I think in my wildest dreams I never anticipated how far and how fast we would go.
Exactly 50 years separated Concorde's maiden flight and the very first direct crossing of the Atlantic in a converted Vickers Bimini bomber. 1919 was the year that aviation trailblazing took off. With the First World War over, there were tens of thousands of planes looking for something to do. For the first time, countries could be linked and oceans crossed. The skies of the world cried out to be conquered. Indeed, the challenge had been thrown down 6 years earlier by the Daily Mail of London, a 10,000-pound prize for the first non-stop crossing of the Atlantic. In June 1919, 2 Royal Air Force pilots, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, arrived in Newfoundland to attempt the 2,000-mile flight to Ireland. Their Vickers Vimy had arrived in crates from England and was assembled on site. Meanwhile, another attempt was underway. 3 Curtiss flying boats of the U.S. Navy set out from Newfoundland to cross the Atlantic in stages. First stop was the Azores to refuel. 2 aircraft failed to get there, though their crews were saved. The third, flown by Lieutenant Commander Reed with a crew of 5, made it and went on via Lisbon to reach Plymouth. Their journey, the first flight of any kind across the Atlantic, had taken 15 days. Back in North America, no less than 12 different aircraft were trying for the 10,000-pound prize. By June 14th, the Vimy of Alcock and Brown was ready for takeoff from the grass strip of St. John's. Groaning with 870 gallons of fuel it needed for the flight, the Vimy slowly took off and headed east at a height of 1,200 feet. Overnight, the 2 pilots battled with fog banks, storms, ice, and dense cloud, while the world waited for news. After 16 hours, they finally reached the coast of Ireland and landed in a bog. An unceremonious end to a great adventure, but both men became instant heroes, claimed their prize, and were knighted. The first non-stop crossing of the Atlantic in 1919 was just one of the many trailblazing achievements of that remarkable year. In November, 2 Australian brothers, Ross and Keith Smith, returning from Europe after the war, took up another challenge. The Australian government had offered £10,000 for the first flight from London to Australia in under 30 days. After an eventful journey of 11,500 miles, the Smiths landed in Darwin with 2 days to spare. Behind such flights was the prospect of commercial aviation. It would be many years before such long distances could be flown by fare-paying passengers. But over shorter distances, commercial flights were already underway. The first international service began between Paris and Brussels in converted French bombers. But it was not a daily service. That began on April 25th, 1919, between London and Paris. It cost £21 and took 2.5 hours. Within a few years, airlines were opening up all over Europe. Other ways were being devised for ex-wartime pilots to show off their skills.
Some of them had the idea of using surplus planes for circuses, flying circuses. Some went around barnstorming to give people 5-minute flights. It was all very novel, but disorganized.
One of the most popular barnstorming aircraft in the United States was the Curtiss Jenny.
The Jenny was a good airplane. you could maneuver that Jenny just anyway and get away with it. I mean, you'd spin it, stall it, side slip it into a field or anything you wanted to do. It was nice to loop, and it was a great airplane for its day. It was easy to handle, no hard work.
In Britain, throughout the 1920s, the showmanship of Alan Cobham's Flying Circus thrilled the crowds. Behind the stunts was a serious purpose, to sell the potential of flying to young and old alike. There were, of course, still plenty of trailblazing routes to conquer, including the ultimate challenge, a flight around the Earth. 26,000 miles over oceans, deserts, mountains, and jungles. In 1924, a group of United States Army Corps flyers assembled in Seattle, on America's west coast, to attempt the epic journey. 4 aircraft, Douglas World Cruisers, adaptable to wheels or floats, set off in April. They headed north to Alaska, where the lead aircraft crashed on a mountain, though the 2 crew were unhurt. The others flew on, along the Aleutian Island chain to Japan, moving in short hops across Asia, through Europe, and to Britain. Wherever they stopped along the way, presidents, politicians, and public all flocked to see the intrepid aviators and their flying machines. In the north of Scotland, they changed back to floats for the final challenge, the Atlantic crossing by way of Iceland and then on to Newfoundland and Labrador. On the first Atlantic leg, another cruiser crashed, but its crew was rescued. The 2 surviving crews clambered ashore onto American soil to a warm welcome. But this was small compared to the greetings they were to receive on their journey across the United States, culminating in a tremendous reception at Seattle, where their adventure began. They had completed the first circumnavigation of the world by air. It had taken 175 days. Behind these trailblazing achievements came the commercial spin-offs. The United States Post Office soon saw the potential of an airmail, and services between cities sprang up all over the country. To start with, it was the pilots of the Army Air Corps who flew the mail. But soon private companies began to compete for post office contracts. A new hero now entered the public imagination, the mail pilot, whose exploits fired the enthusiasm of a younger generation of flyers.
Well, as a boy 11 years old, working at Sid Chaplin Aerodrome, South Hollywood, going out to the field after school on our bicycles, my brother and I, we got acquainted with some of the pilots. And so from then, we kept working around the airport. My idea was to fly the mail because I could fly, and I'd hear these stories about these intrepid mail pilots on the Midwest from Omaha to San Francisco and going across to Washington. This is before passenger lines were flying and before Lindbergh flew to Paris. I couldn't wait to get back and start flying the mail. Looking out from 1,500 feet high and doing 80 miles an hour, fastest we'd ever been, and hearing the wind whistling and so forth, and smelling even some of the gas fumes coming back and watching those rocker arms on the front of the engine. From then on, that was it. We had finally reached a point where when we knew we were going to stay in these airplanes, that was all there was to it. And it was it's been so many years ago. It's been 60-something years ago.
Before the coming of the airmail, it took almost a week for a letter to cross the country. Once regular transcontinental mail flights were inaugurated, it took just 2 days.
The early mail pilots were he-men. They were rough and ready, but lovable fellows who were in the thing because it was a new and dangerous business. Before the navigation aids had been installed, they had to learn their route like a book. Every hill, tree, and river, village, to guide themselves in all kinds of weather.
It'll be a beautiful day, no passengers, no nothing else but just you and the mail and God. You'd get down, you'd fly low, and I said, gee, what day is this? I'm enjoying flying, and oh yeah, there's Miss Fuller's farmhouse. I used to see it from 6,000 feet. I'm right down over the top. Go by. They'd be out waving, and the laundry would be out hanging on the line. I'd say, hey, gee, that must be Monday. Monday's worst day.
I used to drop a newspaper off to my sister. She lived on a farm right on the route between Iowa City and Chicago. And I used to drop her a newspaper every time I fly over. Today, you'd be 5 or 6 miles up in the air, and if you dropped the newspaper, it'd probably land in England. You couldn't do that today.
As time went on, we acquired more knowledge. There was primitive flying. We push our luck sometimes in order to make a good point for the company that had to contract mail carriers. So there were many flights. I look back at them now that I feel a little bit fortunate that I'm here.
It was subsidies from the post office that launched and sustained the airmail. In time, these subsidies led to corruption and scandal. But without them, the U.S. airmail would never have kept flying.
Reaching for the skies, Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original.
In Britain, it was the vast size of its empire that attracted the Trailblazer. In 1925, Alan Cobham set off from Croydon near London on a long-distance flight to survey potential routes for the recently formed Imperial Airways. His destination, Cape Town, an 8,000-mile journey down the length of Africa. His companions, a film cameraman and a mechanic.
One had no meteorological reports. They couldn't even telephone up ahead to find out what it was like. So you flying into the unknown as far as weather was concerned. You might meet low cloud, you might meet a snowstorm, you might meet a dust storm, but you never knew what was ahead of you. One is amazed how on earth he ever found these strips which the local men had cleared in the jungle, but find them he did with a compass. No radar or any of those fancy things, a straightforward compass, and you just steered by looking over the top of the compass and said it must be about there. And somehow or other you found it and landed on this strip. And there this local commissioner would meet you, and there would be men posted about the airplane. I mean, animals really was what you were protecting the airplane from, in case they did any damage to it while it stayed there overnight. The organization that must have gone into these trips is interesting. The trip round Africa would have involved fantastic transportation problems. Cans of petrol have to be there waiting. You have to have made arrangements for that fuel to have been ferried up there, possibly by canoe and so on. The local natives come out to actually beat the land down with their feet and make the runway firm enough for father to be able to take off. Because you can see before they do this, there's one wheel sunk in the mud, and clearly he would not be able to get off at all. thousands of people turn out and welcome this pioneer from England. I should think some of them thought, this madman from England, and if you look at the country that had been traversed, you're inclined to agree with some of them as well.
London to Cape Town in 3 months. One of Cobham's many trailblazing flights across the British Empire.
By that method, he really opened the Empire Airlines step by step, long before there were airlines capable of doing it. These flights had tremendous publicity. The newspapers of England and often of many other places in the world publicized the story, building him up as a great man, and people were enormously interested. He was the pop idol of the day.
Cobham might have convinced the public with his epic flights, but he still had to persuade the British government. To win them over, when he flew back from Australia, he took his case straight to Parliament by landing on the Thames at Westminster.
Lord Birkenhead replies after I'd given my impassioned speech on having an air route to India immediately. And he said, at the present moment when I send a dispatch to India, I say, thank God I can't get a reply under 2 months. Now Cobham is going to have a reply in a week. Life will be unbearable. We don't want airlines.
For the determined aviator, the world still abounded in challenges. The aim of American explorer Commander Richard Byrd was to fly over the South Pole. From the start, appalling conditions delayed the attempt. The crew had to spend the winter in the Antarctic. Byrd's aircraft was a Ford trimotor, and to protect it from the intense cold, the team had to improvise an unusual hangar. Three years earlier, Byrd had successfully overflown the North Pole. Now he and his companions spent the dark winter months of 1929 holed up in their base camp, preparing for their attempt on the South Pole. Spring arrived at last, and with it, suitable weather. The first task was to dig out the trimotor and see if it had survived its hibernation. On November 28th, the trimotor, named the Floyd Bennett after Byrd's companion on his North Pole flight, took off with its crew of 4. Ahead lay a round trip of 1,600 miles, and little chance of rescue if they had to come down on the way. Fuel started to look dangerously low, so the crew threw out everything they could spare to light the airplane. At last, almost 10 hours into the flight, Commander Byrd reached 90 degrees south, the first man to fly over both poles. In the Himalayas, aviators found another challenge: Everest, the world's highest peak. In 1933, a British team led by the Marquis of Clydesdale arrived on the northern plains of India, determined to be the first to fly over the 29,000-foot summit. They had to wait for months for the right weather conditions. Storm clouds and strong winds over the mountains delayed the attempt.
Very few people had been over 30,000 feet, but there was worldwide interest in achieving a height record, and to that end the French had had a stab at it, the Italians had held the record, and recently the Americans. So high flying was a fairly unknown subject. Very special suits of 4-ply material were constructed and fitted with a very elaborate system of heating elements throughout, including boots and flying helmets. That in turn required large electric power, and therefore big generators had to be fitted to the machine. The helmets were similarly heated, and even the goggles and a face mask had their electrical elements.
The teams were also experimenting with cameras and film at low temperatures and great altitude.
The observer on it was taking pictures, and each time he changed a plate, he had to go back into the cockpit. And on one of these occasions, he trod on his flexible metal oxygen pipe. And then when he stood up, the pipe parted completely.
Without oxygen at that height, Bonnet would not have survived. But quick thinking on his part saved him, and the planes went on to fly over the summit.
He'd been working with his camera for a little bit longer, and then he began to pass out, and did eventually collapse completely into the bottom of the cockpit. The pilot couldn't do anything about this, because there was the two separate cockpits.
The flight was a success, but as the cameramen had passed out, both aircraft flew the mission again 3 days later so their achievement could be properly filmed. Adventures like these captured the headlines. More significant for commercial aviation was the challenge to fly non-stop between the cities of New York and Paris, a competition that reached its peak some years earlier at a tragic cost.
And now back to Reaching for the Skies, a TNT original.
In 1926, French aviator René Fonck and his crew were ready to try for the $25,000 Ortig Prize, offered for the first successful crossing. The problem all these Atlantic challengers faced was the weight of the fuel that they had to carry. The critical moment was takeoff, when the load was heaviest. In the flames that engulfed Fonck's Sikorsky aircraft, 2 of his 5-man crew died. Undeterred, a queue of contenders joined the race to cross the Atlantic. Clarence Chamberlain and Lloyd Berthoud began in style, but saw their hopes fall flat when their landing gear broke on a test flight. Commander Byrd was also among the hopefuls. An unfortunate landing postponed his challenge. American pilots Davis and Wooster were preparing for their attempt. On the final test, their tanks heavy with fuel, the aircraft became difficult to control. Soon after takeoff, it plunged into the ground. Both men were killed. From Europe came an attempt in the reverse direction, against the prevailing winds. French ace Charles Nougesor and his co-pilot Francois Colly set off from Le Bourget near Paris, heading west over the Atlantic. The aircraft named the White Bird and its 2 pilots were never seen again. Enter the next challenger, a converted Ryan aircraft named Spirit of St. Louis. 25-year-old Charles Lindbergh had persuaded some St. Louis businessmen to sponsor his bid. On May 20th, 1927, he was ready for the challenge that had cost so many lives.
Lindbergh was a dreamer. Certainly as an airman or pilot, he had as much experience at flying without great assistance from aid on the ground. And so he couldn't resist the opportunity to participate in the race. He was not an extrovert. He was a very conservative character, but not too conservative to try to get in the Atlantic.
Lindbergh would have to fly the journey blind, relying on a periscope or leaning out of the window to see what lay ahead. An extra-large fuel tank had been fitted directly in front of the cockpit between the wings for the best center of gravity. It completely cut off the view forward.
Brakes and contact!
Today, Lindbergh's Spirit is not forgotten. Piloted by enthusiasts, this replica flies regularly, and Lindbergh's own experience of the epic adventure lives on in his writings.
What a beautiful machine it is, in front of the hangar, trim and slender, gleaming in its silver coat. All our ideas, all our calculations, all our hopes lie there before me, waiting to undergo the acid test of flight. For me, it seems to contain the whole future of aviation. When such planes can be built, there's no limitation to the air. My cockpit quivers with the engine's tenseness. Sharp explosions from the exhaust stacks speak with confidence and precision. But the Spirit of St. Louis isn't vibrant with power as it's always been before. I'm conscious of the great weight pressing tires into the ground, of the fragility of wings, of the fullness of oversized tanks of fuel. There is in my plane this morning more of earth and less of air than I've ever felt before. Over the first short stretch of sea on the route to France. The surface is calm. There's hardly a sign of movement beneath the oil-smooth sheen of its skin. It's only 35 miles to the Connecticut shore, but I've never flown across that much water before. I relax in my cockpit, this little box with fabric walls in which I'm to ride across the ocean. Now, if all goes well, I won't move from it for a day and a half, until I step out on French sod at the airport of Le Bourget. There's room enough, no more, no less. My cockpit's been tailored to me like a suit of clothes. Instrument readings are all normal. The engine sounds smoother than at the beginning of the flight. Possibly it's simply the smoothness a well-cared-for engine gains during the early hours of its life. Whatever the cause, there's something in its rhythm that assures me and gives me confidence with which to enter the unknown space ahead, to climb up over the fog, over the sea, and into the night. It seems impossible to go on longer. All I want in life is to throw myself down flat, stretch out, and sleep. I've got to find some way to keep alert. There's no alternative but death and failure. No alternative but death and failure, I keep repeating, using the thought as a whip on my lagging mind, trying to make my senses realize the importance of what I'm saying.
After 33 and a half hours, the Spirit of St. Louis reached Paris.
It's only 100 yards to the hangars now. It would be better to come in straight, but if I don't side-slip, I'll be too high over the boundary to touch my wheels in the area of light. Not a bad landing. I start to taxi back toward the floodlights and hangars, but the entire field ahead is covered with running figures.
It seemed as if all Paris had turned out to greet him. With one flight, he had become a legend, joining the select group of aviation's pioneers, like Louis Blériot. On his return to America, his reception was no less triumphant. Everywhere he went, he drew an ecstatic welcome.
Lindbergh became the symbol of flight. And he was young, he was handsome, and he was taciturn, and he was a kind of an ideal hero. Lindbergh captured the imagination of the world. He was dedicated to the gospel of flight. And it was all really to publicize flight. After all, if you become a god, you want your parishioners to keep on with the incense, if nothing else.
Lindbergh's flight fired an explosion of interest in commercial aviation.
Hi.
Center engine primed.
Ready to start, center engine.
Clear center engine.
The Ford Trimotor, America's first purpose-built airliner, was ready to exploit the public interest.
It was built as a very sturdy plane, and it's still flying, some of them. how very over-strong it had been built because they didn't know what to expect. The Ford Motor Company had been interested in aviation by Bill Stout, who had built a single-engine plane, but Mr. Ford felt he wanted more safety, and so we developed the Ford Tri-Motor plane.
So strongly built was the tri-motor, it could even loop the loop. Henry Ford set up a small production line in part of his giant Detroit car factory to build tri-motors.
We had 2 or 3 aeronautical engineers that came to the Ford Motor Company and supervised the construction of it. It was much more of a hand-built affair. There weren't so very many of them built, you know, altogether. I think it was one of the very first all-metal planes with an enclosed cabin for the pilots, and wheel on at the rear in place of a tail skid, and brakes so that it could operate more like an automobile in that sense. The corrugations were built so they ran in the direction of the wind. And this, we had quite an argument in Europe over this question, because the Europeans claimed they had a patent on corrugations that ran in the same direction as the wind, which seemed too silly for words. Well, nothing like a modern plane. It's heavy. Sometimes you needed help from the co-pilot to handle it in rough weather. It had an excellent wing profile that gave it a good lift.
In 1928, to fly to the West Coast, passengers from New York first had to take the train to Columbus, Ohio. There, they boarded the tri-motor of TAT Airlines, which took them by stages to Los Angeles, including an overnight stop. One of the airline's executives was Eugene Vidal. His son, Gore Vidal, the writer, was the first child to fly across America.
When you look back on it, I mean, they were sublimely uncomfortable, not as uncomfortable as air travel now, naturally. First of all, you always had a container beside your seat, which you were to vomit. And the passengers would just go like that and then go on talking, and the planes are going like that. And then, and I've never seen a description of this overwhelming smell of burning petrol. I mean, you really were almost asphyxiated at times because they hadn't worked out how to air condition these things. My father decided to serve lunch. It was the first time a meal had ever been served on an airplane. And my mother, who was very grand and always on a diet, said, "Oh, everybody loves consomme." Well, the first group from Washington, New York, who had the consomme were scalded to death. In those days, we were not so litigious, so there were no lawsuits. And after that, my father decreed hard-boiled eggs, the only thing they would serve, and coffee, but at your peril, and was always tepid.
For all the discomfort these early passengers experienced, they had the first memorable opportunity to see from the air the grandeur of the American continent. Their journey ended at Burbank Airport in Los Angeles.
We went down so fast that both of my eardrums were cracked. And so, screaming up a storm, I'm taken off the plane with blood trickling down my tiny lobes. My father, the manager of the airline, said, "You loved that flight, didn't you, my boy?" First child to have flown across the country is shrieking up a storm. I'm just going like this at him, you know, and the blood streaming down the ears. That is my memory of the first year of transcontinental flight.
Some early entrepreneurs realized that the new airliners offered other business opportunities.
I formed a company called Scenic Airways and bought 2 of the Ford Tri-Motors and flew them out to the Grand Canyon for a sightseeing service, which is still the oldest sightseeing service in operation. The first time I flew over the canyon, it's almost indescribable, but it's almost a religious feeling you get as you pass over the rim and then the ground suddenly opens up below you and you see this
wonderful expanse of colored rock with the tiny river down at its base.
When Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, there was no organized air passenger service in the United States. Within a year, 60,000 people were being carried by the new airlines. 2 years later, the figure had reached 250,000. Lindbergh had rung in the dawn of a new age of commercial aviation. In many ways, the Europeans had been more far-sighted. Germany, prevented after the war from having an air force, poured its resources into a state airline, Lufthansa. It had regular flights all over Europe, carrying tens of thousands of passengers, long before Lindbergh woke up America to air transport. An airmail service to the outposts of empire was what Britain wanted. And the airline charged with the task of carrying it was the government-backed Imperial Airways. It took passengers too, though not as many as Lufthansa. Luxury was what Imperial offered. And by the 1930s, it had the aircraft to provide it. The Handley Page 42.
Nothing will ever come up to that feeling as I stepped aboard that aircraft for the first time to see this great lumbering giant as it looked then, a cockpit that looked like a greenhouse stuck on the front, all perspex. It was known as the Flying Orange Box, of course, because of the tail formation. The only people that could afford to fly were government officials whose fare was paid, and of course the very wealthy, whose privilege was to fly around the world wherever they chose to go. And it was our job to make that flight as pleasant and as comfortable and as easygoing as possible. Whatever their want, we were expected to supply it.
The HP-42 had to land very frequently to refuel because headwinds cut our ground speed to 30 or 40 miles per hour. It sounds quite remarkable, but we frequently dropped down to those speeds, crossing the desert. We stopped, for example, at Sharjah, which was a fascinating place. To land there on a bench of sand and taxi up to this very solid fort was quite an experience.
Abbas Khan! 6 Saabs coming tonight. Right. I'll come and inspect the rooms in half an hour. Right. Aeroplane coming 5:30. Board the charter. Net! Surface wind and barometric pressure, please. Right. Surface wind northwest 8 miles. Barometric pressure 10.40.2. Wind northwest 8.
America, the priority of the independent airlines was the growing domestic market. But before long, a new company, Pan American Airways System, saw the attractions of an international airmail and passenger service. The airline was the creation of a far-seeing, if ruthless man, named Juan Trippe.
The way in which this force, air transportation, is used will have a tremendous bearing on the future of mankind.
Trippe's first goal was a network of routes from the United States to the Caribbean and Central America. He soon realized that the seaplane was the ideal aircraft for his plans. Few of the countries on his intended routes had airfields, but a seaplane could land in harbors, rivers, and lakes, thus opening up most major cities in South America to his operations. Trippe, however, had even wider ambitions for his tiny airline.
When they offered me the job, I told him, I said, Ron, you don't have enough work for me to do. You only have 2 airplanes. And he said, well, we're going to have a fleet of airplanes. He said, we're going down to South America. He said, we're going over to Europe, and we're going to cross the Pacific. I said, it's amazing. He said, well, we're going to do it.
Trippe set about establishing a network of routes with ruthless efficiency. He started by winning the first 2 airmail contracts to Panama and the Windward Islands. By cultivating foreign governments, he then shut out his rivals and established an effective monopoly on the routes. This pattern was repeated wherever he opened a service. He was accused of corruption with foreign officials and collusion with the U.S. Post Office. But soon Pan Am was booming. Indeed, in some people's eyes, was almost an extension of U.S. foreign policy.
One Trip wanted to be the czar of air transportation. He wanted to have the U.S. premier airline. He didn't want competition at all. He wanted to be the international representative of the country. A ruthless man, of course, as I guess sometimes you have to be. But I have great admiration for his ability and for the wonderful dreams he had and his ability to bring them into operation.
This latest clipper will be christened the Brazilian Clipper by Madame Vargas, wife of the President of Brazil, and will be placed in service on the East Coast trade route between the United States, Brazil, and the Argentine.
Tripp took every opportunity to keep Pan Am in the public eye. He hired Charles Lindbergh to survey and open up new routes, exploiting Lindbergh's skill as a pilot and his fame. And nothing guaranteed press or public attention more than the prospect of Lindbergh inaugurating a new service. Pan Am's fleet of aircraft grew, and so did Tripp's ambitions. He saw the lucrative potential of routes across the Atlantic and the Pacific. With the giant seaplane, the S-42, Tripp first planned an Atlantic service. But when the British, who had no aircraft that could carry passengers across the Atlantic, refused him landing rights, he turned instead to the Pacific. Pan Am began the immense task of building a chain of airports on remote islands and atolls across the great ocean. Lagoons had to be dynamited to clear coral reefs, hotels and workshops built, fuel dumps constructed. The first stage, from Alameda in California to Hawaii, was the longest, 2,400 miles. In April 1935, test pilot Captain Eddie Musick made the first proving flight. It took almost 18 hours. The trip back took 2 hours longer.
They just barely made it back. There were only 72 gallons of gas left in the tanks. Captain Musick was supposed to do his triumphant circle over the city, and he said, hell with that. He came and landed straight in.
In 1937, the British finally had a seaplane they felt capable of crossing the Atlantic, the C-class Empire flying boat. So, they struck a two-way deal with Pan Am. On July the 5th, a Pan Am S-42 flying boat left LaGuardia, New York, to fly to Southampton. At exactly the same time, a C-class Empire flying boat of Imperial Airways took off from Southampton Water, bound for New York. Both survey flights were a success. But to achieve it, the British had stripped out all interior fittings to give their plane enough range. And their Pan Am rival had installed extra fuel tanks inside the cabin. Both were operating at the limits of technology. No airline yet had an aircraft capable of carrying passengers across the Great Divide. It would be another 2 years before an aircraft would come into operation that could comfortably cross the Atlantic. Pan Am's Boeing Clipper could carry 72 passengers and plenty of freight. But 3 months after it came into service, Britain was at war. By the time the conflict ended and the Atlantic was once more open to commercial operations, the days of the great flying boats were over.
Reaching for the skies, a TNT original for the skies, a TNT original.